If you love historical mysteries, but don't know which century to explore next, Greater St. Louis Sisters in Crime has some suggestions. You're invited to Zoom half hours on YouTube as President Fedora Amis, yours truly, interviews working writers. Today, we're revisiting the past with Jo Allison. In addition to chatting about Jo's writing, we're going to explore the meaning of historical mystery. I recently received results from a completely non-scientific survey. My responders consisted of avid readers, mostly women, who buy books and love mysteries. I asked them to choose their favorite subgenres from 8 categories: classic, private eye, true crime, historical, suspense thriller, police procedural, amateur sleuth, and science fiction fantasy. Yes, the categories overlap, and yes, they're arbitrary, but we'd like to have input from you. Send any comments or suggestions you have to fedora@fedoraamis.com. Maybe we should have fewer categories or more. Why? The huge volume of books published each year grows at such an exponential rate that we need more specific words to locate our preferences and to describe them to others, such as bookstore owners and librarians and agents and editors. As for a definition, here's an excerpt from the Encyclopedia Britannica. The historical novel is a work of fiction set in a period of history. Duh. The work attempts to convey the spirit, manners, and social conditions of a past age with realistic detail and fidelity to historical fact. The work may deal with actual historical personages, or it may contain a mixture of fictional and historical characters. Well, here's a little simpler one that I like better, mainly because I wrote it. The historical mystery is a subgenre of 2 literary genres, historical fiction and mystery fiction. These works are set in a time period considered historical, which seems to get shorter every year. Now it's about 50 years, and probably in another year, it'll be 2 weeks. I don't know. It'll be shorter, I bet. These works are set in a time period considered historical, and they attempt to convey the spirit, manners, and social conditions of that era. The central plot involves the solving of a mystery or crime, often murder. And now, today, Jo Allison, our special guest who writes historical mysteries. Jo Allison is from Joplin, Missouri, in the southwest corner of the state. She started her writing career there when she was 20 as a reporter for the ABC television affiliate. She moved to newspaper reporting in Arkansas and Oklahoma, and that reporter mindset shows up in her fiction, both in characters and plots. Later, she took up teaching, research. She has a PhD in economics. I'm impressed at that. And college administration, which is also interesting. Her last 2 academic articles fall under the heading of economic history and center on early voting experiences for women in St. Louis. Jo is the author of a murder mystery suspense series set in 1910's St. Louis, and a forthcoming nonfiction title. Now, this is a long one. Storied and Scandalous St. Louis, a history of breweries, baseball, prejudice, and protest, which is due out in October of this year. She currently lives in Bristol, Virginia. Should anyone care about the dull academic stuff, it's under her legal name, Linda Harris Dobkins. You can find out more about her at her website, joallisonauthor.com, and about 1910 St. Louis at 1910-St. Louis-by-jallison.com. What's more, I happened to look this up. She received the Mary C. Neff Prize for the best article on women from the State Historical Society of Missouri. Now, Jo has her own totally great philosophy about history. She calls it little history, big history, holes in history, why historical writing is fun and maybe important. And she's going to tell us all about that right now. Go for it.
Okay. Well, yeah, and you have to see it written, right? I mean, little history is all lowercase, big history is big events, and both of those, I think, shape all historical fiction, but also plays into murder mysteries. And so I thought that would be sort of fun to talk about. Little history is those day to day details that a historical writer has to get right in order to build a world. We talk about world building, when we're talking about fantasy novels or science fiction, you know, but you're building a world as well when you write historical works of any sort, general fiction or murder mysteries. And in this case, I guess you have to get the science right in science fiction, but you have to get the history right in this case. You have to know enough actual details that your reader trusts you to be accurate to the time period. And so you have to know all those things that people did at the time. I mean, when I'm writing about 1910 St. Louis, I have to know where the streetcars ran. I have to know what kind of music people were listening to, what kind and how, and what language they used, or more importantly, what language they didn't use. You know, for example, I can have two characters go on a date because date was used, the word was used in the way that we use it now, but I can't have them date as a verb because that hadn't come around yet. So when and that sounds like a little thing, and you think, where would I use that and who would know the difference? But as you sort of build the story, those things start to make a difference. They're subtle little markers in the language that you use. Um, I was trying to think of an example that would relate really to murder mysteries. And here's one. I mean, suppose you have a character who's someplace in St. Louis in 1910 or whenever, and they're in trouble. How do they call somebody? A modern reader thinks, well, you pull out your cell phone, but of course you don't pull out your cell phone. You know, okay, so you go to what we now call landlines. I mean, but where do you find a phone? Because certainly not everybody in 1910 had a phone. A lot of people did. Businesses tended to, but not every home had a phone, and not every business had a phone. Okay. So, but here's the thing in St. Louis, if they did have a phone, there were two telephone companies and the lines didn't cross over. You either had a phone that was connected to the Bell Telephone Company or you had one that was connected to the Kinloch Telephone Company. And there was no crossover. I mean, businesses in the city directory would list both phone lines. So even if you're in trouble someplace and you see a telephone, okay, how do you know that it has the right connection, to the line that you want? And that's the sort of little detail that starts to build a sense of another place, another time, a real place and a real time for readers. I've never actually used that idea of having the two phone lines, although I have had characters want to make a telephone call and there was no telephone, except to say, and this is a little environmental thing, all of those phone lines are over the streets, right? I mean, it's double the telephone lines on top of all those new electrical lines. So when you see an old picture, and particularly a picture postcard of old St. Louis, they're almost invariably pretty. And that's because somebody has gone in and erased all of those lines that are over the street, or you couldn't even see the business signs. Okay. And the other thing they've done is probably painted the sky blue because the coal smoke and the haze, you know, I mean, sometimes you had visibility of a block or maybe two, So little things like that can work to your advantage, and you have to know those. And those are the sort of things I call little history. And it behooves you to get them right. It also behooves you not to use everything you know. And I think one of the things that readers sometimes object to in historical fiction is that sense that the writer has learned so much, little history or big history, and they try to put it all in. you know. But I don't think that's the way that it works. It's as if I keep a file in my head. Someday I'll get to that two telephone company thing. But you just have to learn a lot and then use it to push the story and the characters forward. Okay. Now, having said that, there is also this thing that I call big history. And luckily here I get to reference a Fedora Amos book or two. Ooh, the fun part, yeah. But I was once reading, I picked up a Writer's Digest, which is a periodical that writers sometimes take. And there was an article about writing historical fiction. And the author started out saying, if you're going to write about prohibition and you said it sometime before 1920, obviously you'll look like an idiot. And I did not, I should have, I look at the expression on Fedora, so I should have written a letter to the editor saying, oh, please, you're talking about national prohibition, but if you think, and what, we just in 1919 decided not to drink anymore? I mean, that's ridiculous. There is a whole history there of prohibition. And how would you use that in a murder mystery? Well, big prohibition, national prohibition has its own set of tropes that people use. I mean, there's Al Capone and gangs and Kevin Costner running around being Elliot Ness. And I mean, there's all of that sort of stuff that goes with national prohibition. But before that, prohibition was a county by county and a town by town thing. And it divided friends, neighbors, families, even, whether you were for or against prohibition, whether you were dry or wet. Much as we are divided today by, I don't know, abortion or COVID vaccines or whatever. That was a nitty gritty sort of issue long before it was national prohibition. And so that's something that a writer can use. If people feel strongly about something, tempers flare, maybe there's a murder connected to that sort of thing. And so knowing your big history in some detail is really helpful. When I talk about the holes in history, what I mean is reading your history closely enough to find out what historians don't know. And this is where one of my favorites when I talk about this is one of Fedora, I think it was your first book, right? About the possibility that Jack the Ripper was in St. Louis. Okay, now that's a hole in history. Okay, nobody has confirmed that. If you read a history of Jack the Ripper, you may or may not see some reference to that, but that's a hole in history that can be exploited, as Fedora does beautifully in her first novel, and we do that with other novels too. Does your Frank James novel, that may have an element of that too, right? Something that's not really known about somebody or.
Right. Frank James really did live in St. Louis in the last decade of the 1800s, and he really was a ticket taker at a theater, downtown.
Yes, little things like that work. In my work in progress, which is set in World War I, one of the famous issues of World War I was something called the Zimmermann telegram. And you have to pretty much be into history to know about this. It was a telegram sent from Germany to the German ambassador in Mexico saying, if the US declares war on Germany, as of course we did, go ask the Mexicans if they will declare war on the US. Okay, obviously to distract the US from sending troops to Europe. Okay, and it actually promised the Mexicans that if they would do so, and that if Germany therefore won, that they would help Mexico recover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. I mean, let's just take some territory from the US. So this was a big deal, okay? What people don't know is that there was a second Zimmermann telegram that said, don't wait to see if the US declares war on Germany. See if Mexico will go to war with the US now. And this would have been, of course, a political bombshell. That one never came out, except for readers of that book, if indeed that book ever gets published, but it's a work in progress. But readers of that book will have an answer as to what happened to the second Zimmerman telegram, a fictional answer, but an answer. Yeah. And that's why I think writing historical stuff is fun. People tell me all the time that they learn from it, that they didn't realize how widespread prohibition was before 1920, or they didn't know the diplomatic intrigues of World War I. The people who have read early copies of that, and there's just all sorts of history that people learn, and they learn about a different time period. And quite frankly, what I think they learn in part is that people maybe haven't changed all that much. That the things that divide us and the things that bring us together are actually, pretty much the same from century to century. So that's my little thing about writing historical fiction of all sorts, but particularly historical murder mysteries, because the murder mystery part brings it into focus so sharply, makes the history important in a sense.
Absolutely.
So that's why I like reading it.
That was delightful. And there still are such things as dry counties. Jim Beam is situated in a county that's dry. So you can go there and they'll give you a sample, but you can't buy Jim Beam in the county where Jim Beam is made.
Absolutely.
It's really strange, but there you are.
Yes. The neighboring state of Kansas was dry in the 1880s. I mean, that's where Carrie Nation, people broke the law, and Carrie Nation went after them with an axe. I mean, that's historical. But I'm so old. I remember in the 1970s, maybe, the state of Kansas tried to get a law passed that said that airplanes flying over the state of Kansas couldn't serve alcohol on the airplane. I mean, prohibition is one of those things that we think of in a very limited way, but it's much broader than that. So,
and they still had Sunday blue laws, didn't sell liquor on Sundays, or until about 25, 30 years ago, they finally changed that.
Right.
So states and counties could do their own thing by and large. They certainly could. Well, tell us about the new book that you have coming out in October.
Well, this is pretty exciting. There is a series called Storied and Scandalous, fill in the name of the city, okay? That Globe Pequot does. Globe Pequot is the trade imprint of Rowman and Littlefield, which is a fairly big publisher. They do a lot of nonfiction. They do textbooks. I was familiar with them as a college professor because of the textbooks they did. But in the first year, they put out 3 of them, and 2 of them I can remember. One was on Portland, Oregon, and the other one was on Kansas City. Okay? And so the woman who was their acquiring editor at the time had taught school in, let me see, Hazelwood, I think she told me. And it bothered her that there was a storied and scandalous Kansas City, but there wasn't a storied and scandalous St. Louis. So she went looking, and I think she found that website that you mentioned. I have a website out there about the music and the clothing and the speech and all that. It's all the little history that I had collected for St. Louis in the 1910s. She found that website, apparently, which for authors out there says something about the value of doing such things and maintaining
website, yes.
Yeah, and she found that, and we struck up a conversation. She got excited. She had me do a proposal, including a chapter. And the thing of it is, people have different ideas about what's scandalous, right? The guy who did the book on Portland, Oregon, only deals with gambling and the vice that's connected with that, because apparently that's a big thing in Portland's history, which I didn't know, but that's why you read history, right? But I had a broader view of that, and actually one of my fiction books deals with race, basically through the lens of ragtime. And so when I had to write a sample chapter for this nonfiction book as a proposal, I wrote about the ragtime scene and why would that be scandalous? And of course, the answer to that for me was that here is a kind of music that was the basis for, first jazz, and then the blues, and then, rock, and then rap. essentially American music. But in 1910, the only place that you could hear good ragtime from the masters, from Scott Joplin and Tom Turpin, from all these people in St. Louis, right here in the St. Louis is the heart of ragtime in this era. And the only place you could go hear it was in a bar. And you were lucky if that bar wasn't also a brothel, and that was my scandal. And they liked that approach, that I looked at lots of different kinds of scandalous things. So apparently they read my stuff. They got excited about it to hear the story that the editor told me. And they, in March of 2020, they approved a contract for me. And the next day they closed down because of COVID.
Wow.
I know. And so I didn't hear anything back from them until the first week in July when they reopened their office in Connecticut or New York. And by which time I thought, okay, they didn't like it. We don't know what they're going to do. But that was one of the, effects of COVID. So instead of having 10 months to write the book, I had 6 months to write the book.
Oh,
And I couldn't get to libraries. I mean, I actually thought, wow, I'm going to go rent something in St. Louis and I'm just going to live there and I'm going to go to libraries and do all this sort of thing. Didn't happen because of COVID. So at any rate, the book is done. I'm in the process of looking at page proofs and it should come out in October. And I'm very excited about it. It deals with all sorts of definitions of scandal from St. Louis's founding until about 1950. So it is historical.
and there are a lot of great scandals. I mean, there were shootouts in the streets and in those bars you were talking about. That
Yeah.
Out from that came the songs Frankie and Johnny and Stagger Lee
Yeah,
because they were barroom.
I talked about both of those. Yes.
You got both of those, of course.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Were
There were, of course, lots of duels early on. There was Bloody Island out in the Mississippi, and I mean, there's just all sorts of good stuff that can.
a lot of good scandals, sure.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that coming out.
Well, we don't have much time left, and this has been absolutely delightful. I hope you noticed that I'm all dressed up. My time period is late Victorian, the 1890s, which is just 10 years earlier than yours. So we sort of are soulmates, I think.
That's right. That's right. And it would be interesting for readers to look at the differences, in little history and big history, but particularly the little history between the time period when you write and, a few years later. For one thing, in St. Louis, the World's Fair in there changed things.
Oh, yes. Clean water.
Yeah.
That was the main thing.
So people who are interested in St. Louis history with a little mayhem thrown in should sample from those, right? But I love your hat. I mean, where is your fedora?
Oh, well, I'm using that in all of the others. And I thought about wearing a fedora for this one, but somehow it just seemed better to use one of my old costumes from when I was with the Missouri Humanities Council doing shtick as an 1890s person, which is how I got to write about the 1890s, because I had to research it to do the shtick. And it was all great fun.
One of the reasons I think that writers of historical murder mysteries often write series is because you spend so much time learning about the period. It would be such a waste just to write one book, right?
How to do it.
That's our theory. But you look very historical. Very nice.
Yes, I think so. Do you have any last words for us? Any advice for historical mystery writers in the making?
Find a period that you really like and read everything you can find. That's it.
That is great. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it immensely.
I've enjoyed it too.
Bye-bye.
Take care.